Good afternoon from Beyond the Horizon, the organizer of this webinar. First of all, I'd like to welcome all our viewers on YouTube and thank you for turning into another talk of Beyond the Horizon. In 1 hour, we will experience comments of experts on the topic: is reintegration of ISIS returnees a myth or a reality? Lessons to be drawn from Balkans examples. My name is Chirin Totsi and I'll be the moderator today. And I'm very happy to host another fascinating topic at Beyond the Horizon Talk. As always, please send us questions and comments throughout the event, and we will try to answer as many questions as possible. We have today join us 3 great senior experts, and I would like to introduce them one by one. I'll start with the first one. First, we have Dr. Ardian Shaikovsky, join us from the American Counterterrorism, Targeting and Resilience Institute. He is the director of this institution. He focuses on counterterrorism research experience. He is a lecturer and a security analyst with field research experience in the Middle East, particularly focused on Iraq, Syria, and Jordan, Western Europe, the Balkans, Kenya, and Central Asia. He is the co-founder and director of the recently initiated American Counterterrorism, Targeting and Resilience Institute, a US-based research center. Now I'd like to introduce our second speaker. We have Mr. Quitim Butuci joining us from the Department for Analysis and Security Policies at the Kosovo Security Council Secretariat. He is the director of the Department for Analysis and Security Policies at the Kosovo Security Council Secretariat. He is currently responsible for coordinating and monitoring the nation's strategy on countering violent extremism and radicalization, leading to terrorism and all other strategies and policy formulations relating to security issues. He also serves as Nation Security Council Secretariat representative in drafting various security-related laws and strategy documents, including counterterrorism and prevention counter-violent extremism. He is currently located in Pristina, Kosovo. Lastly, we have Professor Vlado Azinovic joining us from the Department of Peace and Security Studies, University of Sarajevo in Bosnia and Herzegovina. He has received a PhD in political science from the American University of London in the United Kingdom and a Master of Art in International Relations from Norwich University in the United States. He is the author, co-author, or editor of a waiting game, assessing and responding to the threat from returning foreign fighters in the Western Balkans in 2018. Between Salvation and Terror, Radicalization and the Foreign Fighting Phenomenon in the Western Balkans in 2017. The geostrategic aspects of jihadist radicalization in the Western Balkans, in the challenge of jihadist radicalization in Europe and beyond, European Policy Center in 2017. Before inviting our guest speakers of today to start presenting their findings and experiences in this very important topic, I would like to say, as a beginning, very few words on this very important issue in the Western Balkans. Together today, we'll examine how the integration of the ISIS returnees is happening in the Balkans. What are the implications for the receiving societies and what lessons should we draw? The Islamic State is still a threat. Thousands of foreign fighters are now returning to their home countries following the collapse of the so-called caliphate. Now these states have to assess the threat, actions, and responses the state should recommend to mitigate risks and rehabilitate and reintegrate the returnees as part of societies. Governments, particularly in the Western Balkans, should consider dealing seriously with the integration of the ISIS returnees. They should improve the regional counter-terrorist cooperation, ensuring that success against extremist elements is more than a fleeting moment. Now, I would like to ask Mr. Shaikovsky if he could give us an overview of the current status and discourses on repatriation of European foreign fighters and their families, and what are the difficulties and risks around the around the trial of returnees. Mr. Shaikovsky, floor is yours.
Good morning, good evening. Thank you, Colonel Totsia. I very much appreciate the introduction. I want to thank you and Beyond the Horizon for organizing the event, and especially for the opportunity to participate alongside my colleagues, Mr. Bipic and Dr. Azinovic today, on what appears to be a pressing transnational topic on the issue of foreign terrorist fighters. Since the collapse of the so-called Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, the SDF has retained the custody of close to 2,000 FTS and close to 10,000 ISIS militants. In addition, Camp al-Hol, which is the largest of the IDP camps in the North and Syria, houses close to 64,000 individuals, mostly women and children. Despite the SDF's, or the Syrian Democratic Forces, professed inability to assume long-term responsibility for the detainees, coupled with the repeated requests by the United States, many governments remain reluctant or unwilling to repatriate. As repatriation becomes more popular, the practitioners and the government believe that, or hope that they would create this sort of cascading effect and trickle down to other countries to solve the threat of foreign fighters on a more consistent and parallel manner. According to most recent estimates, approximately 1,100 European foreign fighters are still under the custody of the SDF forces or in Iraq as well. Given the complexity associated with the issue related to repatriation, I will try to frame my discussion and responses along several key points that I believe seem to govern the most recent discussion on the foreign fighters or the issue of repatriation. So the first thing that I would like to highlight, the very first point would be the diminishing prospect for what I would refer to en masse or large scale of repatriation. European countries have shown willingness to repatriate women and children in most recent years. France, for example, has most recently repatriated about 10 orphans, bringing the number to 36 when it comes to children. Although, for example, 11 of its nationals remain charged with terrorism, or I should say with the death sentences in Iraq as well. But Germany has done the same in many recent years, in recent cases, repatriating 3 women and 12 children, bringing total to 22 in the most recent months, although this does not include the number of individuals who were actually deported under the Turkish custody, not necessarily implying repatriation. So on the other side, or the other spectrum, we have countries such as Denmark and the United Kingdom who have shown to be more strict, if you will, by invoking the right to revoke the citizenship of those jihadis and in general, those who have participated in the Syrian and Iraq conflict. Aside from this category of countries, we have those who kind of are exception to the rule. For example, if you look at Italy, Italy has most recently repatriated women and children, among them an 11-year-old girl who had an Albanian passport, including 2 male fighters as well. The one side of the argument that is that compared to that, say, in other European countries, is that the Italian, for example, contingent of foreign fighters was relatively small, estimated to be about 150 foreign fighters compared to that, say, if you look at the European contingent of that, say, France to 1,900 and Germany close to 1,300. So the second point or the second framework that I would like to kind of tackle would be, and this is one of the most complex ones and relates to the legal challenges. So the first I would discuss the number one, the reluctance to repatriate given the lack of adequate legal instruments and measure to handle criminal courts proceedings upon return. And the second point would be the level of comfort, I would say, or the reluctance to repatriate, rooted in the idea that the Kurdish-run detention centers or camps may be able to both maintain law and order and ensure trial of FTFs, provided there is some kind of international assistance in that realm as well. So very briefly, if we look at the nature of the prosecutions that we're kind of dealing with right now, most of the courts in Iraq and Syria are dealing with nationals. We have, as I mentioned, the case of France, where 11 of its nationals have been charged and sentenced to death penalty, and also the members of the Iraqi military. When it comes to the foreign national courts, We have other restrictions that kind of apply, but maybe we could go a little bit more detail and maybe look at this following chart. So if we look at how the terrorism landscape, so to speak, the framework has been kind of pushed out in the last I would say year. We have foreign terrorist fighters or returnees who are being charged under existing country counterterrorism laws, counterterrorism legislations, and laws that criminalize participation and travel to conflict zones, although that's not necessarily applicable in the context of all countries. For example, foreign fighting, so to speak, is not necessarily a crime in some countries as well. The FTFs who are accused or charged with international crimes, there is efforts, and I don't want to go through all that list, but you could see what are some of the instruments or efforts to try to deal with the issue of prosecution. I would like to maybe point out the important the role of the Untitled investigation team, whose goal is not to only identify and collect evidence and bring witnesses to testify against the crimes that have happened in Iraq and Syria, but also its important role in the home countries, in European countries especially. It has provided evidence in over a dozen trials so far in over 10 countries. So that's one of the most important points that in terms of this sort of international framework or international approach to dealing with the issue of prosecution. The most recent collaborative trends seem to focus on reshaping, again, the transnational jurisprudence, as well as identifying some schemes that could potentially inform the work of domestic courts by means of battlefield evidence. This is not necessarily an easy task, considering battlefield evidence is not explored to the extent it should be, especially its applicability in the domestic courts and how it ties to the criminal code of respective countries as well. As far as the utility of the prosecutions and how it has been played out in the context of certain European countries, it would take, for example, the case of UK. Only 1 in 10 jihadists, according to the most recent UK data, have been successfully prosecuted, and this is largely due to lack of evidence to do so. Maybe Dr. Azinovic and Mr. Bertucci will kind of tap into the context of the Balkan countries as well, and the utility of the prosecutions as well in the case of those who have returned. So what are some of the laws or principles that have governed the prosecution in most European countries? We're talking about active nationality principle, passive nationality principle, universal jurisdiction. We're dealing with, in most cases, terrorism-related charges as opposed to atrocity charges. So here, aside from, let's say, Germany, who has taken a step to dealing with let's say, international crimes, we're talking genocide, war crimes, not much has been done in the context of other countries. Mostly, we have prosecutions that are focused on ISIS and opposition groups, but not necessarily in the crimes focused related to Assad regime. Most prosecutions or charges have been kind of leveled against low-level perpetrators, if you will, and not necessarily more of, I would say, high-ranking officials or soldiers, if you will. So one complexity, and if we were to use this sort of a comparative lens, for example, in the United States, we have within the counterterrorism realm what we refer to as material support statutes, where the government can go after individuals who have provided material support to terrorist organizations in the form of, one, affiliation to specific terrorist organization, and two, providing direct material support, let's say in terms of services, in terms of personnel. We don't see that in the case of European countries, where, again, the crimes have to be rooted within the counterterrorism context and have to be specific and do not necessarily contain the material support statute that we have seen as well. Aside from some instances of documentation provided by non-governmental organization and testimony of, let's say, asylum seekers, in this complicated landscape in Iraq and Syria, the legal modalities of cooperation and information exchange between the international community and the SDF on the issue of FTF, repatriation prosecution, remains very vague. indirect, sometimes controversial. It's mostly implied and never rarely kind of expressed. And in fact, maybe a handful of countries have been transparent about the nature of cooperation with the SDF on the matters related to repatriation and prosecution as well. Of course, there is political and other consideration to take into the place, including the legal constraints that kind of limit the cooperation with the SDF forces. But these are some of the most observing current trends in recent landscape. So the third point that I would like to briefly talk about is the security risk and political backlash. So these two are in a way related. They are, I would say, mutually related. The argument is often discussed within the context of a ticking bomb scenario, maybe namely foreign terror fighters returning with their combat experience and social status they have gained, let's say, in fighting as hardened in the battlefield. Soldiers would take those very same skill in their home country and use that to carry out violence. The idea of returning foreign fighters engaging is often criticized on the ground that most jihadist perpetrators, for example, in the European context, are known to the authorities prior to the attacks, and yet there is difficulties in stopping them. If we look at some of the data, out of the since at least June of 2014, only 14 out of the close to 100 or so individuals have been who have been involved in crimes related to terrorism in the European countries have been returning. So we're talking less than 10% of individuals. So of course the instances such as or terrorism incidents such as 2019 London Bridge attack as well as 2020 Vienna shootings demonstrate the ability of the jihadists or those who have been monitored, at least to some extent, who skills to kind of conceal their identities, beliefs, and engage in attacks. So this kind of ties into the idea that provided there is a large-scale return of individuals from the ISIS territory, would potentially lead to political backlash in the event of potential attacks as well, that could potentially also shift blame towards the government as well. So the fourth point, of course, this is a part probably of a larger discussion, but if we look at for example, the most recent resolution that was blocked by the United States, specifically because France and the UK both used their veto power to oppose the language of the mandatory repatriation of the foreign terrorist fighters from Iraq and Syria, which kind of has placed again a hurdle on the debate when it comes to a large scale or more en masse repatriation of the foreign terrorist fighters. This is again part of the larger discussion, but there's something worth mentioning: the limitations of the international legal mechanisms as well. Lastly, the question of economics and logistical hurdles. Having worked myself in that part of the world for some time, I could attest to, again, logistical hurdles when it comes to engaging in the transfer of individuals from let's say, detention camps in Iraq and Syria. Of course, that wouldn't necessarily be the case in the context of some countries who have less or smaller contingents of their nationals. But let's say we take France, for example, that has anywhere from 150 to 200 adults and then close to 250 children, that would potentially showcase or exemplify difficulties in transfer. Then there is a question of the costs associated with, again, the trials, the surveillance, the radicalization, reintegration, and other prospects as well. So these are, again, some of the things that tie into the idea of economic and logistical hurdles. So with this, I would conclude my presentation. Thank you so much for your time. I tried to condense as much as I could in these 5 more interpretable, if you will, frameworks that kind of reflect the most recent trends as well. So thank you for your attention to the viewers. Thank you, Mr. Totsi, for yours as well. And I look forward to the Mr. Vituch's and Dr. Asinovich's presentation.
Okay, Mr. Tchaikovsky, thank you very much for your very comprehensive presentation. It really was very good. I really enjoyed this one because it was a detailed and a comprehensive one. You provided both sides, the positive one and the negative one, in this domain, which is very challengeable to address and deal and cope with this one, not for individuals or a particular organization, but also for state as well. But anyhow, without further ado, I would like to invite Mr. Quitin Butuce, and I would like him to focus on two very important questions that the audience will be interested to understand and know and get more from his experience. The first one is about it's about more about lessons. What lessons can we take away or can we draw from the case of Kosovo for a successful rehabilitation and integration? That is my first question. And the second one is more about the security implications and potential threats in that we know post-repatriation period that have been identified in the case of Kosovo. Mr. Butuce, floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Toci, and thank you very much for this great opportunity to talk today about the Kosovo experience in fighting violent extremism and terrorism. I'm very happy, also very glad to be in the panel today with two very experienced experts on this field. So just to make sure that my slides are moving, I don't know why I'm not.
Not for the moment. Slides are not moving.
Just a second. Yeah, so just to remind in the beginning that Kosovo population still practice traditional and moderate Islam and sets a very good example of interreligious tolerance in the region. But unfortunately, the process of religion friction in Kosovo began after the war in Kosovo in 1999, and especially after the too many international humanitarian organizations came in Kosovo, like Saudi Arabia and some other countries who financed the charities which controversially advocated the religious practices that contradicted local Hanafi-based norms in Kosovo. That situation brought the spread of Islamic radical ideologies in Kosovo. Consequently, a worrying fact in Kosovo was the spread of Islamic extremist views, which played very important role in Islamic radicalization and the violent extremism. There is an example that 8 of the 11 imams, Kosovo imams, arrested between August and September 2014 on charges of preaching extremism and helping to recruit jihadists, were relatively young and educated in countries such as Saudi Arabia and Egypt. Those countries who also have their humanitarian organization in Kosovo. There is also a case of Imam, his name is Zechiria Chazimi from Gilan. He was arrested on suspicion to be one of the main mentors of jihad. There is evidence that at least 11 Kosovo jihadists, almost all killed in Syria, were recruited by him and sent to Syria. So again, these imams have brought a more extended interpretation of Islam to challenge the traditional moderate practice in religion, in region. When you talk about the numbers, we can say that the total Kosovans, nationals, men, women, and children who traveled in Syria is 358, including 52 women and 50 children. And if you can see in this table chart, we can see that the total number is 436 because many children have born in Syria, and many of them also have been killed. When you talk about the threat, what kind of the threat the returning foreign fighters can pose in the country of their origin. This is a very important issue for all countries who are repatriating the foreign fighters. So returnees are often perceived as a threat for many reasons, but most important for two: because of their possible involvement in domestic terrorist plot or terrorist attacks resulting from their war experience, and the second, their future engagement in recruiting, further radicalization, spreading propaganda, and providing different logistical support. There have been never any kind of terrorist attack in Kosovo, but there have been terrorist attacks by the Kosovars outside the Kosovo. There is an example of foreign fighter Blerim Heta. He was a UK resident and he was traveling from the UK in Syria. He became a suicide bomber in 2014 in Iraq, killing 52 Iraqis. There is another also case in March 2014 when Chandrim Ramadani, again a Swiss citizen originally from Kosovo, who murdered 3 security officers in Niger, Turkey, together with his friend, Albanian friend from North Macedonia. So they have both fought for Syria. I said before that there was any terrorist attack in Kosovo, but there was a terrorist plots in Kosovo and also the region. There is a case example here of 2016 when the Kosovan, North Macedonian, Albanian citizen have tried to do a terrorist attack in Albania during the football match between Albania and Israel. And you can see that in 2018, 8 men from Kosovo have been sentenced to the prison of terrorism charge for this specific case. I did also the research in Kosovo related to the terrorist plots. Here you can see 3 cases, Gilani Badovci and football case. And you can see the participation of foreign fighters and their sympathizers. And you can see that there is not a huge number of foreign fighters who have been involved in these terrorist plots. There are just 5 and 26 sympathizers in general, in total 31. And in percentage, it's just 5%. But everybody knows that returning foreign fighters' involvement can increase the probability that a terrorist plot can be executed and would kill many of the people. When we talk about the returnees, we can say that there are 2 generations of the returnees in Kosovo, in the Balkans, and maybe all over the world. The first is the people who have departed at early stage to fight the repression of Assad regime in Syria, which are generally more regret, potentially less violent, and have been able to live the area in their own. So they returned before 2014-15. And the second generation are those who departed or who wanted to be the part of the establishment of the ISIS Caliphate in 2014, and they have all departed with their families, and they are considered to have more combat experience and stronger ideological convictions. Also, we should not we need to consider also the very dangerous possible foreign fighters who have been prevented to leave Kosovo for Syria. These individuals who do not succeed in reaching their destination are considered to be or to have a potential to act in accordance with ISIS ideological conventions. Kosovo is considered to be a very successful story in preventing and countering violent extremism and terrorism. We have approved several documents, which these 3 are more important. So the law for prohibition of joint armed conflicts outside state territory. Those found guilty face a jail term up to 15 years. There is also the National Strategy Against Terrorism which is from 2009, but now we have a new one updated in 2018 until 2023, 22. And also we have a so-called soft approach, the strategy for prevention of violent extremism and radicalization that lead to terrorism 2015 and 2020. And we believe that this year we are going to also to revise this strategy and to have a new one from 2021. I hope until 2026. According to based on these documents, we have arrested dozens of foreign fighters and financiers and their supporters. You can see here, so we have arrested 159 and also sentenced 156 and so on. In general, 300 individuals have been suspicious of having committed acts of terrorism or have been involved in promoting regional extremism in Kosovo, and they have been all monitored by the police. I'm not going to go deeply, but just to mention that international partners or donors have played a very important role in preventing violent extremism and terrorism in Kosovo, providing different financial support for the different programs. Just to mention that when we talk about the de-radicalization rehabilitation program in prison, the Minister of Justice or Correctional Service has played a very important role. So we have implemented specific programs for foreign fighters in prison, individual programs. We have approved the strategy for establishment of unit for the management of extremism in the prison, and also we have assigned a memorandum of cooperation with the local imams to be part of the established unit and to give religious services in the prison. When we talk about the rehabilitation integration, not just of the prisoners, but also of their families, children and women which came back from Syria, here the Minister of Interior is playing a very important role. We have established specifically just for this reason prevention and reintegration division, which is led by the lady, Ms. Ganimeti Gerbovci. So this division is very important, and they are coordinating with multiple intergovernmental agencies all cases or each extremist or offender released, but also they have a specific plan to how to work with the children and women which came from the Syria war. And I believe that everybody knows that Kosovo in April 2019 or Kosovo government brought 110 Kosovan citizens from Syria. Just few countries in the world brought such a huge number of people in one plane, if I can say. So this was a government operation with us, that's the United States. All the refugees have been from the Al-Rawi and Al-Half camps. 74 children, 32 women, and 4 men, which have been jailed on arrival. They have stayed 72 hours in asylum center near to Pristina, and immediately they have started with the programs. According to the psychologist, all returnees have been with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Immediately we have started these psychotherapeutic sessions, a separate compensation for the teaching hours for children, and also we have during the summer 2019 we have organized several cultural activities, sport activities, study visit, and so on. So still today, the Prevention and Reintegration Division is working with the multiple international agencies in order to support this category of the people to be back into society, into community, together with other also ministries like Minister of Health, Education, Labor and Welfare, local authorities, psychologists, social workers, religion experts, and so on. Just shortly, I would just would like to mention because we have talked about the threat, the kind of the threat that foreign fighters can pose, just to mention that there is still active group of the Kosovan peoples who are fighting in Syria. Maybe you've heard about Jamaat al-Ban, which is a small Sunni jihadi militant group operating in Idlib government and who are ethnically Albanians, not just from Kosovo, but also from North Macedonia and Albania. They are fighting Assad regime. They're always showing propaganda videos from 2017, 2020 and until now. They never show their face. Their commander is from North Macedonia, he's Albanian. It is a very small unit, very professional snipers, and they are connected with the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. This is my slide, last slide. I would like a little bit to talk about the challenge. So always funding of the project is a challenge for the Kosovo. Normal the capacity building for these countries in the Balkans and lack of experience also in central and local level to deal with this category of the people is always challenging. Having in mind that there are too many foreign fighters, their families back in Kosovo, it is very hard to monitor all returned foreign fighters and those who are released from the prison. Implementation of rehabilitation or integration program, not just for Kosovo, but also for other countries, is always challenging. And I believe that the relatively low sentence that returns are getting, which is in Kosovo, average in Kosovo is 3.5 years in prison, cannot delay the threat posed by the individuals and not reduce it. So I believe that we didn't have enough time to work with this category of the people in the prison, because when we started with the rehabilitation and integration programs, majority of the prisoners have been already released. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have any kind of question, I'm ready to respond. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bertucci. Thank you very much for this very comprehensive one. Dear followers, we had another very good question. Now, in this case, focusing on a particular case, in case of Kosovo, getting some more practical understanding about this issue, how this issue has been addressed by the Kosovo, state of Kosovo. But now I would like to invite Professor Azinovic. He will tell us from his perspective lessons identified from the case of Bosnia and Herzegovina and how they rehabilitated and integrated the returnees of ISIS. Professor Azinovic, floor is yours. Thank you.
Mr. Totic, thanks for organizing the event and extending the invitation. And thank you also for providing me with the opportunity to sit on the same panel with my esteemed colleagues. We have been asked to share our experiences in rehabilitation and reintegration of former ISIS fighters and their families in some 10 minutes. There is really a lot to share. So in order to provide you with at least a glimpse of what we now know, I have borrowed the structure for my presentation from military historians. They typically claim that defeats in war come from three types of failures: failure to learn and understand, failure to adapt, and failure to anticipate. So I will briefly touch upon the things that we have learned in this process. I'll try to explain the way we have tried to adapt, and I'll also share some of our anticipation for future risks emanating from this particular type of challenge. Before I start, just a brief overview when it comes to figures illustrating the scope of the phenomenon that we have been researching over the last 10 years. I'm, of course, not in an official capacity, don't represent any official Bosnian institution. So I cannot give you the exact numbers because they're considered as classified. I, of course, have a detailed breakdown, but I'll just give you the rough estimates. And these numbers, I believe, will serve the purpose. And the purpose is to understand the extent of the phenomenon. So some 190 plus men, more than 70 women, and 100 children were taken by their parents to Syria and Iraq. In addition, additional 120 children have been born over the last 6 to 7 years. And that's another problem that we are probably going to face rather soon. More than 140 individuals have died or were killed in the process, and some 60 individuals, of which some are children, mostly men, and some women have returned over the last 8 years. We still have some 200 plus individuals in Syria, including another Bosnian contingent still at large in Idlib province, just like the Albanian Jemaat that Kutim was talking about. These people are still at large, armed, and from time to time they fight as a Turkish proxy force in Syrian war. But the most of the people, 65% of them, are still in camps and detention in Syria and Iraq. These are the early pictures from the glory days of ISIL, where so many Bosnians, like many people from other parts of the world, rushed to help the effort. They proudly posted their pictures of their wives and children on social networks, social media. But over the time, the enthusiasm vanished for this type of adventure. And since 2016, we had no new departures. We can clearly see at least two, we call them clusters of returnees. The first cluster is, mostly people who returned individually between 2012 and 2019, people who were gradually absorbed by their local communities, mostly immediate families, because immediate families play a very important role in tightly knitted Balkan societies. So they're not, we don't know the extent of their radicalization now, but we know that many of these individuals returned disappointed by what they saw in Syria and Iraq. Many of them believed that they had done their duty and that enough was enough, so they returned gradually. We have not seen any problems with these individuals thus far. The second cluster is, the one that we received at the end of December 1919 with the support of US Army and Syrian Democratic Forces. It was the first group deportation to Bosnia of Bosnian citizens formerly engaged with ISIS. So we received 7 men, 6 women, and 12 children. Men were automatically arrested. All of them are, I think, sentenced by now. But we are now working actively, myself included, with these women and children and trying to help them face the realities of Bosnia today. Both my predecessors addressed the issue of criminal prosecution. And this is also something that we see as a problem in this country. It seems that judiciary is very lenient when it comes to sentencing these individuals. I have to remind you that none of the women have been charged thus far, and it's gradually creating problems in our efforts to help them reintegrate into society. I can explain in detail, provided there is interest later. So the average sentence for foreign terrorist fighting related crime in Bosnia and Herzegovina is 2 years and 2 months. And when we know that we have no programs in prisons aimed at any kind of support for these individuals, so even such a narrow window of opportunity to start engaging these male terrorists or former terrorists is practically non-existent. And what we see is the third prospective cluster of Bosnians still in Syria and Iraq, and there's a lot of them. There's more than 130 individuals in prisons and detention camps. More than 60% of these individuals are children. So these people are waiting probably another group deportation, provided such an operation is feasible in the future. What we have learned from working with these women, typically because all men are in prison and we don't have access to them, is actually that rehabilitation, that the whole process begins at the entry point to the country. In our case, it was at the airport. So I was there to meet them together with some of my colleagues. We treated them with respect, humanely, regardless of our knowledge about the ideology and their potential involvement in this story. But when you treat people with respect and humanely, it pays off in many different ways. And this was actually the opening for rather successful work with these women and children that ensued later. What we also saw very early is that mental health issues dominate these efforts. all of these individuals, women in particular, have been, they've been traumatized. Probably they have multiple traumas. In case of Bosnia, many of these individuals have been born prior to Bosnian War or during the Bosnian War. Then they endured the war in Syria and life next to the battlefields. And of course, we also established through the work of our psychologists that in many cases, we observe passive dependent personality structure, in some cases disorder in these women, which then provides an explanation as to how easily they were recruited and followed their men to Syria and Iraq. I won't go through every single bullet point in these slides. I will just stop on one or two that I believe matter the most. Continuity is also something that is very important. Rehabilitation and reintegration is not a type of 9 a.m. till 5 p.m. Working day. And we are really engaged with these individuals, 24/7 throughout the year, especially when you develop, and it's necessary that you do, when you develop personal relationships with some of these returnees. And when you know their personality structure, when you know that they always have to rely on someone for guidance, for an advice, you are virtually on the speed dial and constantly engaged, and you have to be constantly ready to answer dozens of questions that sometimes seem very simple, maybe even stupid, but these questions seem necessary to answer in order to continue the intervention when it comes to these individuals. We also realize that there is an opportunity for engagement of other actors, local communities, social services, and centers for mental health that are also playing a very important role in providing assistance, different kinds of assistance to these individuals. We also saw law enforcement in very non-traditional roles, playing an important positive role in the process, where police officers outside of working hours are basically available to these individuals in many cases and solve their everyday practical problems. Also something that usually comes by automaticity, and that's the role of religious leaders. I'm sure you know that throughout the Western Balkans, so we have institutionalized official Islamic communities. And there was always an idea that, official imams could engage with these guys, try to somehow influence their understanding of religion and things like that. But it doesn't work. The official structures of the Islamic community in Bosnia and Herzegovina, for example, is seen as arch enemy among these individuals. So trying to arm force them, to arm twist them into, engaging with official imams always backfires. So we are avoiding this for the time being. Also, what we see as possible challenges in the future, what we anticipate as a problem, some of these things have been mentioned earlier, possible re-engagement that comes with the territory, we cannot avoid it. What's a problem is a lack of structured sentence management and reintegration support for prisoners. There's Council of Europe's project aimed at working with prison authorities, but we are still putting it in place. By the time we complete it, these people will be out of prison, so we will have no one to work with. Also, we have problem with so-called invisible children. In many instances, and it's no secret, many of these women actually lived in polygamous relationships, and they have children with multiple men, of which not all of them are Bosnian. So we have a lot of our women having children with international foreign fighters. So establishing the parenthood in many cases is going, again, to be rather difficult for all of us. Also, the question of success. How do we measure success? Well, I can tell you, I can talk about how we can measure the success, but I think it's important at this point to say how we should not measure the success. In some instances, in some countries, including Bosnia initially, we thought that the success is when a woman takes off her niqab. That's like the ultimate proof that she's completely out of this mindset. But when you get to know them better, sometimes you realize that the niqab is actually a shelter from the outside world, that in many cases these individuals were not capable to deal with, and that it means much more than just a religious ritual or dress code. So taking off the niqab is not the ultimate or any kind or measurement of success, and we should avoid these things. I think I'm nearing the end of my presentation, so I will stop here. We expect more deportations. We have some 20 men, 30 women, and almost 80 children in detention camps in Syria and Iraq. And what is also important to remember, the second cluster I was referring to and the third cluster is composed of individuals who stayed with ISIL until its very end. And the reason they want so desperately to come back to Bosnia in this case is not because they are so homesick and they love their country, but they were so desperate to come back because they ran out of all other options. And the level of their radicalization and the level of traumas for men in prisons and for women in camps over the last 2 or 3 years, and the horrible things endured there has probably created more antagonism towards anyone, let alone the home country they'll be repatriated to. And this is something that obviously worries us. So I'll stop right here, and of course I remain available for any questions that anyone has. Thank you.
Professor Hasanovich, thank you very much for this very comprehensive and very detailed presentation. I really liked when you begin with identifying what you have learned and what you have adapted and what you have to anticipate. That was a very good start, and I really enjoyed this one. But let's start with you first. I would like to start with you first by addressing the questions. Few weeks ago, or months ago, when I was doing research, I identified a analyst, and he was writing about the returnees in Bosnia, and he said the Bosnia nervously waits ISIS women and children to return back home. Why the Bosnia and Herzegovina society was nervous when these returnees, the ISIS foreign fighters, were nervous? Why? Can you elaborate a little more? Maybe it will be very interesting for the audience to understand a little more.
Why the public in Bosnia was nervous?
Yeah, the society. Why the society? Yeah.
Frankly, I was nervous because I was so deeply involved in the research, and we were preparing ourselves for the welcoming of this group deportation. But this was really never a big issue in Bosnian public discourse. We have a very complicated political situation, and any terrorism-related stories are always provide a potential for political manipulation in everyday politics. But I haven't seen their nervousness around this particular issue. On the contrary, Bosnia has three individuals as a president of the state. So we have a presidency. And these three guys actually voted unanimously for these individuals from Syria to be deported to Bosnia. And that was the first decision that all three members voted for, actually. So there was even a political consensus that these individuals should return, and I haven't seen their nervousness. The media tried to create a forensic atmosphere because it sells well. It's an attractive media story for 48 hours, and then we switch to something else. But when it comes to ordinary people, they were not even aware of the phenomenon itself, and let alone of this particular deportation of 7 men, 6 women, and 12 children.
Thank you very much, Professor Hasanovich.
Sure.
Now I'd like to address a question to Ardian. Ardian, you have provided a very comprehensive presentation, which I really like. But always when we identified cases, for instance, in the West, and you already mentioned Denmark, for instance, and another country, they were not willing to return these foreign fighters back home. Why do European countries not repatriate their foreign fighters, or they don't want to bring their citizens or their citizens back home? Can you elaborate a little more? Can you provide a little more data and facts? floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Colonel Totsi. That's a great question. So the case studies, or the exceptions to the rule, so to speak, when it comes to countries like Denmark and UK, when it comes to citizen revocation, obviously there is again a lot of decisions on the revocation are tied to local politics, are tied to the question of potential political backlash as well. We have had also the case of one of the cases here in the United States where, to my belief, that person is still in Syria, and the government has not repatriated that person precisely because of the inability to establish the citizenship of that U.S. citizenship of that person, despite the claim by that person that she has a U.S. citizenship. So again, these are very isolated, I should say, incidents, or maybe the rhetoric that's kind of being pushed out there in the case of Denmark and the UK, likely to be challenged as they have been legally in the courts as well. And this has been happening, let's say, in the case of Shamima Begum, which I had a chance to meet personally a few years ago in Syrian camps as well. And I know that the case is being challenged in domestic courts as well. So I guess it's a waiting game. We have to wait out, see how that plays out as well. One thing that I kind of wanted to also point out why there is this sort of hesitancy on the part of European countries to deal with the issue of repatriation has to do with the level of comfort that I kind of pointed out. They're rooted in the idea, again, that the Kurdish-run detention camps may be able to deal with the prosecution of so-called their citizens. So in one instance, a year ago, I was in this conference in Syria where the very topic was about creating this international tribunal where the foreign fighters would be tried through the international court system and a system from the international community, which seemed to have fallen flat in recent months as well, but it's still being circulated around. However, what we see on the part of some European countries, again, reflected in some of their policy decision, is that holding trials is the viable solution. Holding trials of European citizens, it's by the SDF, it's a viable solution. And it's also one of the ways to contain the threat posed by ISIS, kind of delay their return to homeland, but also provide justice of some sorts through these transnational justice mechanism, but also through the involvement of the international community. The side to that story is that if we look at, this is something that our research and research of other institutions have reflected, that the SDF forces have so far sentenced about 8,000 Syrians who have been suspected of belonging to ISIS, and groups like Jabhat al-Nusra, but haven't necessarily dealt with, for example, cases of there were Turkish-backed Syrian rebels, for example, Suleiman Shah Brigade and others. The research or interviews in some cases with the court administrators in the north and northeastern Syria shows that about 1,500 cases of local Syrians have been tried since 2014, and about 4,000 to 5,000 remain to be tried. So some argued that at this current rate, we're expecting, potentially over a decade by the time the foreign terrorist fighters could be kind of qualified or come to the stage for potential prosecution as well. So again, a lot of discussion on what's happening is can be termed in those two spheres. One being that, again, there is a reluctance, I would say intentional reluctance at this point to bring FTFs, meaning male foreign fighters, whether for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. But when it comes to women, there is a desire to bring them, but there's, again, this logistical, this economic associated hurdles that seem to be kind of postponing the issue. As far as how these things are playing out with the citizenship revocation and other policy consideration at the European level, I think we'll have to wait and see, and probably we'll see more changes in that realm.
Okay, thank you very much. I see that we are receiving some questions now, but we don't have so much time, but I will give, just a minute or 2 minutes to quickly, Mr. Butice. Mr. Butice, there is a very simple question for you about the public perception towards the repatriation of ISIS foreign fighters in Kosovo. Can you say very shortly, what was the public perception about the returnees in Kosovo and how you were dealing with this one? Very briefly, time is very limited, only 60 seconds, sorry. Over to you.
This question for me, right?
Yes, question for you, Mr. Butice.
Okay, so very shortly, the public opinion was that they should be back then, and better to bring him back earlier than later when they are more, how to say, radicalized or something like that. So public opinion, not just the foreign fighters, but also for women and children, are very positive, and all society think that they should be reintegrated and be back normal in their life in Kosovo.
Thank you very much, Mr. Butici. I see that we are receiving some questions about this one, but we don't have time. I see we are running out of time, but I see the last one. A question for Professor Arsenovic. One follower is asking, we are talking about ISIS. Is Nusra, HTS, or other Salafi jihadist terrorist organization less dangerous? Do they currently possess a threat? Mr. Professor Arsenovic, only 2 minutes to you. Can you elaborate a little on this question which we have received from the audience? Over to you, Professor.
Both groups have been classified by the UN resolutions as terrorist groups. So we don't treat members of any of these groups differently. They violated the law, and the fact is that more people associated with ISIL are coming back, and that's why, and of course, initially more Bosnians joined ISIL than Al-Nusra Front. I guess it applies to most of contingents from the Western Balkans. So in terms of percentages, when it comes to Bosnia, up to 80% of Bosnians have joined the ISIL. So that's the reason why when we sentence these individuals, they constitute a majority of those who are being sentenced. But there are no difference there's no difference in treating these individuals before court.
Thank you very much, Professor Arsenovic. We have to stop here because time will not allow us to continue. I see that we have received some other questions, even they are very theoretical ones, and they will require another hour to discuss. As you said, Professor Arsenovic, at the beginning of your presentation, in 10 minutes or even 50 minutes, it's impossible to address this very important issue, not only in the Western Balkans, but also in the rest part of the world, in Europe and North America or other countries. But anyhow, I would like to say something to the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, I mean, if you go and research a little, you can find a vast number of writings about this very important issue, and you can get a better understanding. Luckily, we have so many scholars and think tank institutions which are providing so much effort to address these issues based on X or Y experiences. Today, we had a possibility to bring two experiences, the Kosovo case and the Bosnia-Herzegovina case. Now, thank you very much, Professor Arsenovic.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stajkovski. Thank you very much, Mr. Butici, for joining us today. I really enjoyed, and I hope the audience enjoyed these very comprehensive presentations and interaction that we had together. Thank you very much again. I hope to see you soon in the future. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good.